33 minutes after 12. £40,000 this year in service charges alone after ending up owning a flat which is unsellable due to cladding issues on the outside. Peter, I almost hesitate to ask, but you're about to tell us how things now get even worse.
I mean, it's unfortunate. That's the case. So the next step is what irrespective of the waking watch, which is a totally useless mechanism for detecting fire, which we've had our own designed over the last weekend as a more effective situation, and irrespective of the insurance companies putting up insurance by 10 times. Our block is constructed in a way which contains what's called a curtain wall cladding system. So each piece is made somewhere else and then lifted into place with a crane and attached to the inside of the concrete load bears. In order to take out this less than 50% of combustible materials, this one type of insulation in our block, we are going to have to strip the entire building back to its original concrete load-bearing walls, which is an uninhabitable position for every resident in here. We will have to destroy every floor in every flat, every wall, every inside wall, every window, take off every balcony in order to get this out, on the basis that we don't know whether this building will pass or fail the test or not, because we can't get it, because we can't afford a test, and we'll miss the application for the funding, which will... I
honestly think...
leave us bankrupt.
No, well, of course, I'm surprised you're still afloat at all, to be honest with you. Who do you... Forgive me for this question, and by all means decline to answer it, but who do you blame?
It's not really an allocation of blame.
No.
It's more an allocation of a hip-jerk reaction for an issue which is extremely important, but you cannot filter down the problems to the structure of leaseholding, which means you leave it to the base leaseholder. It's certainly not the freeholder's problem. To be clear, this is not a freeholder issue. It's not an original contractor problem, because I have the certificates of my building in my drawer. They passed every building control test process that exists. The building is very well constructed. It's a total lack of clarity and covering ourselves, and an insurance problem. In everything we do, in any type of construction, in walking down the street, in buying a property, you take an allocation of risk.
You do.
We are living in an apartment block in the centre of London.
Yes.
If you are putting down that these guidelines, there is really no legal basis to what is being recommended, other than the person who makes a decision as a resident is criminally liable if you ignore them and the building burns down.
Why do you know so much? Because you've had to go on a crash course as a result of finding yourself in this predicament, or is it your work as well?
No, we're just... So this is... I'm purely a resident of our block.
So it's the crash course.
I put myself forward with a number of others late last year to become a member of the resident committee in order to paint the inside of the block. And so now we have been deemed under the fire regulatory order as the responsible person for the lives of everybody in this block on the crash course of this is what happens. Because it's the stress. It's a full-time job on top of a normal job, a voluntary, as a normal resident, dealing with the same stresses as your finances and the capability that this block may not exist next year, because we may have to abandon it if we cannot do the measures.
Yeah, how much would you be in the hole for?
It depends which stage. I mean, we're trying to enforce a voluntary waking watch, which will cut costs. We can't afford the insurance currently. If we didn't get the first come, first served cladding grant, which is only for £1 billion anyway, it's estimated about 25 billion is needed to resolve this across the UK. Wow. If we don't get the application for that funding, our external costs are anywhere between 4 and 8 million to replace the outside of our building. So we will just walk away. Everybody will walk away.
There are
residents already in this block who have lost their job because of COVID, who have families, who have already been, in our little group meetings in our lobby, saying that they might as well give the keys to the bank. Well, the bank doesn't want the keys because the flat is worthless.
And will they still? And they'll still be liable for the debt to the bank, even if they can't.
Well, exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
This is
So
appalling.
this system needs more structure. It's not a blame thing. It needs stepping in. Insurance companies cannot increase the insurance by 10 times. It needs to be underwritten by the government.
No, of course.
If
And the extension to the application for the grants needs to be...
Extension application for the grant. You need Waking Watch doesn't work. If you need an alarm system, there should be public-private bodies who can fit an alarm within a set period of time for a reasonable cost. You cannot just implement hip-jerk reactions, and then every stage of the process, from insurance to fire engineers to assessors to consultants to original contractors, covering themselves in every way. You cannot leave it on the low.
Well, have you been in touch with Rachel Venables yet?
I sent her an email, I'm hoping she'll get back in contact.
Well, I shall encourage her to move that email up to the top of her to-do list, because this is... I can't remember the last time this happened on the radio. I mean, it's all as a result of Rachel's work. But this is just unbelievable. That story there it's like a kind of... Well, you made a joke about an anxiety dream earlier. This is on a completely different scale. And look, the plural of anecdote is not data, he says, for the gazillionth time this year. But I do have a vague ability to judge things. And I know this is, if you're a student of such matters, this is a story that will prompt people who've never rung radio stations before in their life to ring in. Because it's as if you've turned on the radio and we're talking directly to you. So the scale and the volume of the calls coming in is impressive, but you have to see it in context. Like so many things. You have to see it in context. And the context is, oh my God, finally someone's talking about our situation. You don't get that if you're trying to do a phone-in about whether or not tanks are now obsolete, which was the other contender for our conversation together this hour, and Look, I'll be honest with you, I was a little bit keen on that story about tanks, but then when you see things like this take off and you see the quantity and the quality of the problems, well, you realise why this is such a huge job that Rachel has done. 12:40 is the time. Victoria's in Bethnal Green. Victoria, what's your story?
So we're in an incredibly challenging situation. We live in a shared ownership housing association flat, and we were told in 2017 by the housing association that we didn't have any cladding on our building. So I thought no more of it. I had a baby in December, and we decided that we were going to move this year. And just before the pandemic, I was chatting to one of my neighbours who's part of our residents association, and she told me she was pretty sure that we did have cladding, and the residents association had been asking for the survey for about a year. And it was at that point that I sort of fell down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
It turns out that a building does have flammable material, but we've never been formally notified. We know this because the building manual confirms that we have 3 types of potentially flammable material, including HPL. Despite this, the only letters the Housing Association has sent us is to say, please do not have fairy lights or barbecues on your balcony due to cladding concerns.
Oh.
The only other letter we've had to confirm it is that if they do not secure the government grant, they will be issuing us a Section 20 notice for the works. So we've never actually had the cladding confirmed by the Housing Association, but we have had it confirmed that we'll be paying for it when they eventually notify us.
And what are we talking about, Victoria? Do we know?
We have absolutely no idea. I mean,
and you can't even think of selling until this is sorted.
No, so all we know is we can't sell, we can't move, we don't know how safe our home is. I mean, I've had to call out the fire brigade and get our own independent fire inspectors to just come and have a look, just to tell me that it's safe enough to bring my baby home. I mean, I moved into my mum's for 5 months because we just didn't feel safe enough. And those letters arrived during the pandemic where people were locked in their homes all day, on top of the fact that we've also got all of these problems with the Housing Association, like our communal boiler didn't work. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. We get a letter to say your building might be flammable, so don't have fairy lights. Oh, and also the hot water doesn't work, so no one can wash their hands. So we still don't know. I put my child to bed at night not knowing whether there's just a tiny little bit of cladding and it's relatively safe, or whether the building is, a massive fire hazard.
And forgive me if you've already told me this, but I am genuinely reeling from your story and from Peter's. But what is the best case scenario on getting what needs to be done?
Well, it's really challenging for us.
You need the EWS1.
So they've done that after a lot of lobbying by the Residents Association, and me and my neighbours are involved in a housing association-wide action group with lots of members, and we've realised that this is a problem affecting dozens of buildings, and the policies that housing association are telling us related to the cladding are just changing building to building. Yeah. So we've written to journalists and broadcasters and radio stations and the Deputy Mayor of London and MPs and regulators, and people just don't know what to do. And our situation is so much more complicated because we don't know how unsafe our building is. So we have no concept of whether it's safe to live here or how much the cost could be.
How are you holding it together? I'm sorry if that's a slightly silly question.
Really badly, to be honest.
Well,
I'm on maternity leave.
Yeah.
It's the middle of a pandemic, so it wasn't the best maternity leave anyway.
For sure.
And, we flip. I think not knowing is the worst thing for us because on a good day, we can convince ourselves that actually our building's probably pretty safe, that there's only a little bit. It would have been fixed by now if it was really dangerous. Yeah. And then on a bad day, we think, we've had so many problems with our housing association, right down to things like the boiler. So why would they be doing a good job when it comes to the cladding? And so actually our building could be incredibly unsafe. It's just that we've not been shouting loud enough for it to be rectified. And just not knowing how much we're going to be made to pay is terrifying.
No, but that's real, as I keep saying, and I'm feeling it's a little bit inadequate now as a description. That's real sort of tea time of the soul stuff in the middle of the night where we've all kind of wrestled with potential problems. I can't imagine anyone's ever thought that this might be on the horizon. I suppose I should apologise now for the fact that it is now on your horizon. A lot of people will be sort of wondering about what would happen if their house was potentially and suddenly rendered worthless. At least in the short term. One of Rachel's case studies earlier, 10 years. Well, Victoria, I can promise you that this entire radio station will be staying with this story for as long as it takes. But what's scary, and I do, again, I said frightening earlier, I use this word advisedly. What is scary is the absence of any roadmap. Even Paul and Victoria, who have clearly been on crash courses in all of the relevant information, still very unclear on what the future might hold or what success would look like or what the solution might be. I don't think I will ever forget Paul telling me that some of his, not flatmates, what would the word be? Some of the fellow flat owners in his block are already talking about leaving the keys behind and moving out. And the bank will still be after them for however many tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds they borrowed to buy the flat in the first place. Or Victoria, again, telling us that would it be safe to bring my baby home on maternity leave during this? And then the letters arriving during lockdown. So the possibility that your home isn't safe is introduced into your life when you can't leave it. I often worry about this country's increasing rejection of empathy, but I have a feeling that this is one of those stories that everybody can feel the horror of. They're as rare as hen's teeth these days. Absolutely rare. But surely everybody can see that this is just awful. 12:46.